Clint Lawrence was a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army, deployed to Afghanistan in 2012. At just 28 years old, he took command of a platoon in the 82nd Airborne Division, stationed in the volatile Kandahar province, a known Taliban stronghold. 3 days into his command, on July 2, 2012, his unit was on patrol near a remote village. Ahead of them, 3 Afghan men approached on a motorcycle. They weren't armed. They weren't aggressive. Lawrence, convinced they were enemy scouts, ordered his men to open fire. 2 of the men were killed. Some soldiers hesitated. Later, they would testify that the men posed no threat, and that Lawrence had pressured them to shoot. He later claimed the Afghans were combatants, but several of his troops came forward, saying the reports had been falsified. The Army launched an investigation. In 2013, Lawrence was court-martialed and convicted of second-degree murder, attempted murder, and making false statements. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison and sent to Fort Leavenworth. But outside the prison walls, a movement was growing. Conservative veterans, media figures, and political groups began portraying Lawrence as a scapegoat, punished for acting decisively in a war zone. His case caught national attention. In 1919, after 6 years behind bars, President Donald Trump granted him a full pardon. Lawrence was released and greeted as a hero by some, but condemned by others. His own platoon members were outraged. One said, "He doesn't belong on the street. He's dangerous." Many insisted the men who died were innocent civilians, not enemy fighters. Since his release, Lawrence has written a book, appeared on national TV, and advocated for military justice reform. He continues to defend his decision. But the controversy remains. To some, he's a victim of war's harsh realities. To others, a man who used power recklessly and got away with it. Clint Lawrence's name still divides the military community, a symbol of the fine line between duty and a deadly mistake. Michael Behenna was a first lieutenant in the U.S. Army, deployed to Iraq in 2008. He was an officer in the 100 Onus Airborne Division, leading a platoon assigned to protect supply routes and engage insurgents in a volatile region. On May 16, 2008, Behenna's unit was escorting Ali Mansour Mohammed, an Iraqi man suspected of ties to an al-Qaeda bombing that had killed 2 of Behenna's soldiers weeks earlier. But due to a lack of evidence, Mansour was ordered to be released. Instead of letting him go, Behenna and another soldier took Mansour to a remote location, under a bridge near the desert village of Baiji. What happened next would become one of the most controversial killings of the Iraq War. There, Behenna began an unauthorized interrogation, demanding answers. According to Behenna, Mansour reached for his weapon, and he shot him twice, killing him. But investigators and prosecutors told a different story. They said Mansour was naked, unarmed, and executed. His body left in a ditch. Behenna burned his clothes in an attempt to hide what had happened. The Army charged him with unpremeditated murder, and in 2009, Behenna was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Supporters argued he was justified, that he acted in self-defense, and had been forced to release a terrorist who could kill again. Critics said he had taken the law into his own hands. After several appeals, Behenna's sentence was reduced to 15 years. In 2014, after serving just 5 years, he was granted parole. Then, in May 2019, he received a full presidential pardon from Donald Trump, erasing his conviction entirely. The White House called him a hero who had been wronged by a flawed military justice system. Behenna's release drew mixed reactions. Some saw it as long overdue, a correction to battlefield injustice. Others believed it sent the wrong message, that soldiers could kill prisoners without consequence. Today, Behenna lives in Oklahoma, where he's returned to civilian life. He remains a polarizing figure, praised by some, condemned by others, and a lasting symbol of the blurred lines between vengeance, justice, and war. Barrick Miller was a U.S. Army National Guard sergeant, deployed to Afghanistan in 2010. A trained infantryman from Maryland, he had already completed 2 prior tours and was known as a reliable, experienced soldier. But during a routine patrol in the Lagman province, Miller would make a decision that would cost him nearly a decade of his life. and raised difficult questions about combat justice. The mission was standard: secure a rural village and meet with local elders. During the operation, soldiers spotted an unfamiliar Afghan man inside their perimeter. He had entered the area with a group of mechanics, but no one knew who he was or why he was there. Miller became suspicious. With tensions already high and fears of insider attacks common, he detained the man and began to question him. He believed the man was lying and possibly scouting for an ambush. What happened next is where stories diverge. According to Miller, the man lunged for his weapon, and he fired a single shot in self-defense. But prosecutors argued otherwise. Witnesses said the detainee was sitting down, not resisting, and that Miller shot him point-blank in the head. The man was an unarmed Afghan civilian. In 2011, Miller was convicted of premeditated murder at a court-martial. He was sentenced to life in prison and sent to Fort Leavenworth. His family and supporters were devastated, insisting he had been punished for making a split-second decision in a hostile environment. Over time, veterans groups and political allies rallied around him. They claimed Miller had acted to protect his unit, not murder an innocent man. His case became part of a larger movement questioning how America prosecutes its own soldiers in war zones. After serving 8 years, Miller was granted parole in May 2019. He returned home to Maryland and began speaking publicly about military justice reform. For some, his release was a long overdue correction. For others, it raised uncomfortable truths about how the rules of war are enforced and who pays the price when things go wrong. Garrick Miller's case remains deeply polarizing. Was he a warrior punished for doing what needed to be done, or a soldier who crossed the line? What's certain is this: one man is dead, and the debate over whether it was justice or survival will never fully go away. John E. Hatley was a U.S. Army First Sergeant, a highly decorated non-commissioned officer with multiple combat deployments. He had served honorably for over 20 years, leading soldiers through some of the toughest battlefields in Iraq and the Balkans. But despite his long career, Hatley's legacy would be forever changed by an act that never made headlines during the war, but would come to define him afterward. In 2007, while deployed to Iraq, Hatley's unit captured 4 suspected insurgents following a firefight near Baghdad. The men were detained, disarmed, and transported in a military vehicle, bound and blindfolded. But instead of turning them over to higher command, Hatley and 2 fellow soldiers made a fateful decision. They drove the detainees to a remote area near a canal. There, Hatley and his men lined the prisoners up, executed them with rifle fire, and dumped their bodies in the water. No photos, no reports. The incident was never recorded in official mission logs. For months, the killings were a secret. But in 2008, soldiers from Hatley's own unit came forward, revealing the story during unrelated investigations. A formal inquiry followed, and in 2009, Hatley was charged with premeditated murder, obstruction of justice, and other crimes. At his court-martial in Germany, prosecutors said he had violated the core values of the Army, taking justice into his own hands and murdering men who were no longer a threat. Hatley denied personally pulling the trigger, but witnesses said otherwise. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. He was sent to the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth, where other convicted war criminals were held. Yet even behind bars, Hatley remained a figure of controversy. Supporters, including some former soldiers and military advocates, said he had been abandoned by the Army after decades of service. They claimed he was forced to operate in a morally gray zone, where rules changed daily, and justice was sometimes a luxury. Over the next decade, a legal effort pushed for his early release. And in October 2020, after serving 11 years, Hatley was paroled. He returned to Texas and resumed civilian life quietly. He has rarely spoken publicly about the case. For some, Hatley's actions were the ultimate betrayal of military ethics. For others, they were the grim result of a war that forced soldiers into impossible situations. The men he executed were never tried. Their names were never released, their families never informed. But the legacy of what happened, of 4 unarmed prisoners gunned down in the dark, remains one of the most haunting war crimes committed by a U.S. soldier during the Iraq War. Charles A. Graner Jr. was a U.S. Army Reserve specialist, trained as a military police officer. In 2003, he deployed to Iraq and was assigned to Abu Ghraib prison, just outside of Baghdad, a place already infamous for its brutal past under Saddam Hussein. But by the time Graner left, it would carry a new legacy, one tied to the United States. Graner wasn't a new soldier. He had served in the Gulf War and worked as a prison guard in civilian life. In Iraq, he was placed in charge of detainee operations, tasked with guarding Iraqis held for suspected insurgent activity. Many of them had not been charged with any crime. Some were innocent, others were petty criminals. Few had seen a lawyer, and none had a trial. And it was in this environment, lawless, chaotic, and poorly supervised, that Charles Graner became the central figure in one of the biggest scandals in U.S. military history. In late 2003, military investigators received photos taken by soldiers on Graner's team. What they found stunned the world. Images showed naked prisoners stacked into human pyramids, others chained in stress positions, hooded and leashed like dogs. In one image, Graner smiled beside a detainee with wires attached to his hands, a pose meant to simulate electrocution. In others, prisoners were beaten, sexually humiliated, and taunted. The photos weren't hidden. They were passed around among soldiers, even used as souvenirs. Graner was seen not just participating, but orchestrating the abuse. Testimony from fellow soldiers said he encouraged humiliation and told others to toughen up. He called the prisoners animals and treated it like a joke. In 2004, after the images leaked to the media, the Abu Ghraib scandal exploded. The U.S. military and the Bush administration faced international condemnation. The photos undermined the U.S. mission in Iraq, sparked protests across the Middle East, and were used in extremist propaganda for years. Graner was arrested and charged with multiple counts of abuse, assault, and conspiracy. At his court-martial in 2005, he claimed he was just following orders, saying intelligence officers and higher-ups had approved the techniques. But witnesses and victims told a different story. That Graner led the abuse, and others followed his lead. He was convicted on 10 counts and sentenced to 10 years in military prison. Graner was the first and most high-profile U.S. service member convicted in the Abu Ghraib case. He served his sentence at the U.S. disciplinary barracks in Fort Leavenworth and was released on parole in 2011, after serving 6.5 years. Since then, he has lived in relative obscurity. But the impact of what happened at Abu Ghraib, and Graner's role in it, hasn't faded. His name remains forever linked to images that changed how the world viewed the American military. To many, he became the face of shame, a symbol of unchecked power and failed leadership. Yet the debate continues. Was Graner a rogue soldier, or part of a system that encouraged abuse and only punished the lowest ranks? Either way, the damage was done, to the victims, to the mission, and to the moral image of the U.S. military itself. Agustin Aguayo was a specialist in the U.S. Army, born in Mexico and raised in California. He joined the military in 2002, believing that he could serve honorably, help others, and pay for college. But just 2 years later, Aguayo would become one of the most well-known conscientious objectors of the Iraq War, a man who refused to fight and paid the price for it. Aguayo served as a combat medic with the 1st Infantry Division. He was deployed to Iraq in 2004, where he provided medical support during patrols and combat operations. He didn't carry a loaded weapon. He treated the wounded. He followed orders. But what he saw there, and what he was asked to be part of, changed him. Over the course of that first deployment, Aguayo began to experience a growing moral and ethical crisis. He was deeply disturbed by the war's impact on civilians, the violence he witnessed, and what he called the dehumanization of Iraqis. By the time his tour ended, Aguayo had made a decision. He could not participate in war again. Upon returning to Germany, where he was stationed, he filed a formal application as a conscientious objector, a legal status for those who, due to deeply held beliefs, cannot participate in combat. He believed that taking another human life was fundamentally wrong, no matter the uniform. But the army rejected his claim. arguing that Aguayo's beliefs didn't meet the strict definition of conscientious objection. He was ordered to deploy again to Iraq in 2006. Aguayo refused. When the day came for his unit to leave, he slipped out of his base through a window and went absent without leave. He stayed in hiding for several weeks before turning himself in. By then, the army had charged him with desertion and missing a troop movement, serious offenses that carried years of prison time. In March 2007, Aguayo was court-martialed and convicted. He received an 8-month prison sentence and was dishonorably discharged. But outside the courtroom, Aguayo's case became a national and international story. Human rights groups, peace activists, and legal scholars debated whether he had been wrongfully punished for his beliefs. Was he a coward or a principled objector? Aguayo insisted that his stand wasn't about politics, it was about morality. He wasn't anti-American. He simply believed that taking part in war violated his conscience. After serving his sentence, Aguayo was released and returned to civilian life. He went on to speak publicly about his experience, advocating for changes to how the military handles conscientious objector claims, and calling attention to the mental and moral toll war can take on service members. Today, Agustin Aguayo remains one of the most visible cases of moral resistance within the U.S. military during the Iraq War era. He never killed anyone. He never fired his weapon. But in many ways, his battle was just as personal, a quiet war between duty and belief. Camilo Mejia was a staff sergeant in the U.S. Army National Guard, an immigrant from Nicaragua, who came to the United States as a teenager, attended college in Florida, and later enlisted in the military. He served honorably for nearly a decade. But in 2004, Mejia made headlines not for heroism in battle, but for walking away from the war in Iraq. He would become the first U.S. combat veteran to publicly refuse to return to Iraq, sparking a national debate about duty, morality, and the legality of the war itself. Mejia deployed to Iraq in 2003, during the early phase of the war. As a squad leader with the Florida National Guard, he saw combat in the Sunni Triangle, one of the most dangerous regions at the time. His unit was involved in daily firefights, raids, and patrols. But what he experienced there shook him. He later described seeing abuses of Iraqi civilians, including excessive force during raids and the mistreatment of detainees. He also spoke of inadequate equipment, poor planning, and a chain of command that, in his words, dehumanized both soldiers and civilians. Mejia began to question not just the mission, but the morality of his own participation. He was given a 2-week leave in late 1903 to return to the U.S. to sort out a family emergency. But while home, he made a decision that would change his life. He would not go back. Instead, in March 2004, Camilo Mejia surrendered himself to military authorities, not as a fugitive, but as a man taking a stand. He declared himself a conscientious objector, citing his personal transformation and opposition to the war in Iraq as a matter of principle. The army rejected his application. He was charged with desertion and put on trial. Prosecutors argued that Mejia had failed his fellow soldiers, that he left during wartime and endangered the mission. Mejia insisted that he had acted according to conscience, not cowardice. In May 2004, he was convicted and sentenced to 1 year in prison. He served approximately 9 months at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, before being released in early 2005 with a bad conduct discharge. But outside the prison gates, Mejia became a symbol. A soft-spoken, thoughtful young man who had traded his rifle for a message of peace. He wrote a memoir titled Road from Araramadi, in which he described his moral awakening and his growing belief that the Iraq War was both illegal and unjust. To some, Mejia was a hero, the first soldier to speak out from within the ranks. To others, he was a traitor, someone who broke his oath and turned his back on his unit. Today, Camilo Mejia continues to speak at schools, universities, and peace conferences. He advocates for human rights, veterans' issues, and the right of soldiers to say no to wars they believe are wrong. His name may not be as well known as others from the Iraq War era, but in military history, he stands out for being the first to resist, not with violence, but with conviction. Bo Bergdahl was a U.S. Army private first class, later promoted to sergeant, who became one of the most controversial figures of the war in Afghanistan. His name is remembered not for battlefield heroism, but for a decision that led to his disappearance, 5 years in Taliban captivity, and one of the most politically explosive prisoner swaps in U.S. military history. Bergdahl deployed to Afghanistan in 2009 as part of the 500 Honest Infantry Regiment. He was stationed in Paktika province, one of the most volatile areas of the country. Just weeks into the deployment, Bergdahl grew disillusioned with his mission, his chain of command, and the military itself. On the night of June 30, 2009, Bergdahl walked off his post, leaving behind his weapon and gear. He wasn't captured in a firefight. He wasn't ambushed. He left voluntarily and vanished into the Afghan desert. Hours later, the Taliban announced they had captured an American soldier. For the next 5 years, Bergdahl was held by the Haqqani Network, a brutal Taliban-affiliated group. He was moved from compound to compound, often beaten, kept in a cage, and subjected to prolonged isolation. He later described being chained to a bed, starved, and physically tortured. Back home, the U.S. military launched repeated rescue missions and intelligence operations to find him. Several soldiers were injured during these operations, and some later blamed Bergdahl for the cost, in lives and resources, that came with searching for a man who had chosen to walk away. In May 2014, after long negotiations, President Barack Obama authorized a prisoner exchange. Bergdahl was released in return for 5 senior Taliban detainees held at Guantanamo Bay. The deal sparked immediate backlash. Supporters praised the administration for bringing an American soldier home. But critics, including members of the military, accused the White House of trading away dangerous prisoners for someone they considered a deserter. The controversy only deepened when details of Bergdahl's disappearance became public. In 2015, after a long investigation, the Army charged him with desertion and misbehavior before the enemy. The latter, a serious offense that can carry a life sentence. In 2017, Bergdahl pleaded guilty in a military court. He said he never intended to desert permanently, but had hoped to draw attention to problems in his unit by walking away and triggering a response. He acknowledged that his actions were wrong and endangered others. The judge sentenced him to a dishonorable discharge, a reduction in rank, and forfeiture of pay, but no prison time. The ruling stunned many. Some viewed it as a fair resolution for a man who had already endured years of torture. Others called it a disgraceful failure of justice. Even years later, opinions remained sharply divided. To some, Bo Bergdahl is a deeply troubled young man who made a terrible mistake and paid for it with his body and mind. To others, he's a coward who abandoned his brothers in arms and sparked a diplomatic crisis that empowered America's enemies. What's certain is this: his case exposed cracks in the military justice system, deepened political divisions at home, and left scars that still haven't healed. Paul Nicholas Whelan was a former U.S. Marine, born in Canada, raised in Michigan, and working in corporate security when he took a trip to Moscow in December 2018. But just days after arriving, Whelan vanished and reappeared in headlines around the world as a man accused of being a spy. What followed was a dramatic and still unresolved international standoff that left him imprisoned, caught between 2 rival superpowers. Whelan's background was unremarkable on the surface. He had served in the Marine Corps Reserve from 1994 to 2008, deploying once to Iraq, but received a bad conduct discharge for larceny-related offenses before his service ended. After leaving the military, he worked in IT and security, eventually becoming the director of global security for a Michigan-based auto parts supplier. In late 2018, he traveled to Russia to attend the wedding of a fellow ex-Marine, or so he claimed. Whelan had been to Russia multiple times before, and had even opened accounts on Russian social media platforms. He said he loved the culture and was there as a tourist. But on December 28th, while staying at a hotel in Moscow, he was arrested by agents of Russia's Federal Security Service, FSB. Authorities claimed he was caught in the act of receiving classified information, a flash drive allegedly containing a list of Russian state employees. The Russian government accused him of espionage. The U.S. government immediately denied the charges. Whelan insisted from day one that he was innocent, that he was set up, and the flash drive was supposed to contain vacation photos. He said he had trusted a Russian acquaintance to bring him the file, unaware of its contents. His family backed him, calling the charges ludicrous. But in a Russian courtroom, where due process is limited, and political motives often shape verdicts, it didn't matter. In June 2020, Whelan was convicted of spying and sentenced to 16 years in a high-security labor colony. He's been imprisoned in Mordovia, a remote region notorious for its harsh prison camps. Behind bars, Whelan described poor medical care, threats from guards, and long periods in solitary confinement. Still, he's continued to maintain his innocence, and his case has become a flashpoint in U.S.-Russia relations. American officials, under both the Trump and Biden administrations, have labeled him wrongfully detained and a political hostage. He was passed over in several high-profile prisoner swaps, including the 2022 exchange of basketball star Brittany Griner for Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout, leading to widespread criticism. Whelan himself expressed anger at being left behind. In 2024, a shift finally came. After more than 5 years in Russian custody, Whelan was released in a rare and highly sensitive prisoner exchange involving multiple nations and intelligence agencies. The details of the deal were not made public, but officials confirmed that Whelan had been freed and flown home. To this day, Russia still insists Whelan was a spy. The United States maintains that he was innocent. Whelan's story is no longer just about a tourist or a former Marine. It's about geopolitics, leverage, and the value of a human life in the arena of global diplomacy. Whether guilty or not, he became a bargaining chip, and his fate a reminder that when nations clash, it's often ordinary people who pay the price. Joseph P. Mayo was a sergeant first class in the U.S. Army, a seasoned combat veteran deployed in Iraq in 2007. At the time, he was part of the unit conducting operations in the turbulent streets of Baghdad, where insurgents blended in with civilians, and every mission came with life-or-death choices. But one day, that line between battlefield action and cold-blooded killing was crossed. The story begins during a mission in early 2007, when Mayo's unit captured 4 suspected insurgents following an armed clash. The men were disarmed, zip-tied, and blindfolded, no longer a threat. Protocol required that they be handed over to the proper authorities for processing. But that didn't happen. Alongside First Sergeant John E. Hatley and another soldier, Michael Leahy Jr., Mayo took part in an act the Army would later call an execution. The soldiers loaded the detainees into a military vehicle, drove them to a remote area near a canal, and shot them. The men were murdered in cold blood, their bodies dumped in the water. No one reported the incident. There was no paperwork. Officially, the detainees were never even in custody. It might have stayed buried, if not for soldiers from the same unit who came forward months later, during an unrelated investigation. Their testimony sparked a full-blown criminal case. Mayo was arrested and charged with premeditated murder and conspiracy. During his court-martial in 2009, he pled guilty and openly admitted to the killings, expressing remorse. He was sentenced to 35 years in military prison, a punishment lighter than Hatley's life sentence, in part because of his cooperation and guilty plea. But the controversy didn't end there. Like other soldiers involved in the case, Mayo had supporters, people who believed that war blurred moral boundaries, and that soldiers operating under extreme stress shouldn't be judged the same way as civilians. Veterans groups called for clemency, arguing that Mayo was trying to protect his men in an environment where insurgents regularly escaped justice. In 2015, after serving just 6 years, Mayo was granted parole and released from the U.S. disciplinary barracks at Fort Leavenworth. Today, he lives quietly, out of the spotlight. But the memory of those 4 detainees, their identities unknown, never went away. And Mayo's story continues to raise painful questions about leadership, accountability, and what happens when the rules of war are ignored. Not in the heat of battle, but after it ends.